So now we're going to sort of jump a little bit ahead in time. We're leaving Galileo and Copernicus in a slightly earlier period, and we're zipping a little bit forward to the late 18th century and the coming of the French Revolution. Okay, so in sort of building up to look at the changing symbols, the changing art, architecture, the changing belief, which is almost a kind of, it's almost kind of not quite a mockery of Catholicism, but it definitely uses Catholic aesthetics and ritual and puts them to a dramatically different use of basically praising revolutionary ideals in a way I think that we'll see. So the first thing that we want to think about is what was going on religiously, economically, politically, in France that led to such a huge upheaval against the monarchy, against the aristocracy, and for our purposes, most importantly, against the Catholic Church. Because we remember from earlier classes that we've had, France had always prided itself on being the so-called eldest daughter of the church. And there had always been a very, very strong connection between the French sort of collective national self-consciousness and its Catholic identity. How so? Which sorts of figures are both impeccably French, making us think about the French sort of political leadership or military leadership, and this very, very strongly Catholic identity? Who have we studied who were kind of like icons of at once Frenchness, French nationalism, and Roman Catholicism?
Joan of Arc?
Yeah, Joan of Arc. Exactly. Joan is absolutely the most wonderful, variegated, multifaceted symbol because you can make her mean almost anything you want, because there's so much packed in, right? She can be a feminist icon, she can be a monarchist, she can be a revolutionary, she can be a proto-Protestant, she can be an early trans sympathizer. I mean, you can basically make out of this potent, powerful, compelling story of reversal pretty much anything you want. But certainly one thing that everybody would agree about with Joan of Arc is she's about as French as it gets, right? And she's been seen, in fact, we'll sort of see during and after the French Revolution, she's actually kind of co-opted in some ways by both sides, pro-revolutionary movement, because this is an illiterate teenage girl from the backwoods of Lorraine who becomes a national icon and installs a king on the throne. That seems sort of French revolutionary, except for the king part, right? What do you do about that? I mean, in the French Revolution, they're looking to topple and chop the heads off kings and queens and all of their highly powdered aristocracy while they're at it. Why? Because they're fed up. They're fed up. And we can see that from the art of the time. It's what we're looking at is, whoops, kind of like the newspaper cartoons of the era. And some of them are not super great quality, but hopefully you can see we have this blinded, naked, emaciated figure. He's in chains. This is ordinary people, right? How they start to see themselves and their lot right before the French Revolution. So these are ordinary people. And why is this guy so, tired and poor and worn out? Because he's carrying all these fatties on top of him. He's carrying bishops. He's carrying, you can see it's a bishop because of his mitre. That's the name for the bishop's hat. And his crozier, that's the name for the bishop's symbolic crook, right? Because all the pastoral language of the Bible talks about sheep and shepherds and this kind of thing. So the bishop's kind of big question mark thing is supposed to evoke that sort of pastoral image. So the poor old peasants are forced to carry all these fatties who do nothing, all these layabouts, all these people who do nothing with their own hands, but sit around and titter into perfumed handkerchiefs and see how big and puffy they can get their big white wigs, or sit around and get fat, saying the rosary and ripping people off. There's this kind of groundswell of this isn't fair, right? And we can see how similar this one is to this one. There's the sense that the third estate, so ordinary folks, are really being crushed by these other two that are so much smaller in terms of numbers, but so much richer in terms of their wealth and their lifestyle, right? So you can say that this one perhaps is a little bit more dramatic because the guy's carrying them on his back and he's naked and poor and weak and in chains. But you can also see this one, even though this guy is better dressed, he's actually being crushed by this mass of rock that the other two are standing on. So in terms of the language about the estates, this merely refers to the sort of breakdown of who did what in society, right? So the first estate is the clergy, the second estate is the nobility, the third estate is just ordinary people, right? So in the urban poor, urban working people, the peasantry bringing in all of their goods, grains, produce, livestock from the rural areas. These are the ordinary people. These are the people that are starting to feel sucked dry by a system that does nothing for them. So if we want to sort of translate the fear and anger and frustration that led to the French Revolution into contemporary terms so we can kind of get our heads around it better, the closest we might find to a modern French revolutionary would be somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's constantly railing on about the 1% versus the 99%, and constantly reminding us that what unites most of us is that we aren't Bill Gates, and that we aren't, who's that freaking guy who's constantly going up in space? Bezos, right? He reminds us of the super rich. He reminds us that while it's popular right now to think about Russian oligarchs, we've got our own kind of oligarchs here in North America, people that have just obscene amounts of money and don't really seem to want to spread the wealth, right? A lot of contemporary kind of critique about different companies. It's fashionable to think about how much more the chairman or the president or the head of the company makes than workers in the company, or to think about an entity like Starbucks, which is just basically minting money, and how they often don't seek to protect even the most basic rights of their workers, right? So if we sort of think about these contemporary conversations and kind of retroject them backwards into late 18th century France, it gives us a sense. Now, of course, what it doesn't really help us get is that we live in essentially a much more democratic, much more horizontal zone that is at least putatively democratic, right, than France at the time, which was one of the most rigid and vertical societies in Europe at the period. So Elizabeth's saying that there's always a hierarchy, there's always a form of aristocracy. So yeah, that could lead us to some wildly Marxist kind of stuff going on, that maybe the aristocracy might not wear powdered white wigs anymore, but there's still patterns of pervasive privilege, whether based on education, race, whatever, So there's more that kind of unites us with this kind of fervor of French revolutionaries, of whom in many ways we are the beneficiaries and the successors in terms of how we live now. So there's this kind of groundswell of anger. And while you may have taken courses or classes about the French Revolution, a lot of conventional historians more focus on the political or the military aspects, which is understandable. We do start off with a kind of groundswell movement among ordinary people and end up with this absolutely astounding spectacle of a king and queen losing their heads to the guillotine in the public square. So no wonder that story has kind of dominated. But for our purposes, we're more interested in the religious changes brought about by the French Revolution, how it affects how people think about the church, and what they're prepared to do in terms of real and symbolic violence to express that dissatisfaction with the church and its agents. No one had to remind me. I remembered about coffee break. Okay, it is now pretty much 9:15, so we're going to take 5. I know we've just gotten started on the French Revolution, but it's probably good to stop here. That way we have a good run at it of a good half an hour before we have to break for the end of class. So by all means, please do go ahead, take your little break now, unless you have something that you want to talk to. Hey, let's rock it. Let's get back to the images. Okay, perfect. All right, so we've got this situation where people are angry and they have a reason to be. And their view of their overlords, the aristocracy, and their view of the church are pretty much hand in glove, because just like we were talking about with the symbol of Joan of Arc, there's a strong, strong link between the idea of the French nation as French and the idea of the French nation as Catholic. And you're going to see this come undone during the French Revolution. And this is epical because of the strength of this association previously. So when I'd asked you for figures that kind of incarnate the sense of French Catholicism, people said Joan, but of course there's many other figures that we could turn to. Like who? Who's a saint and a French king?
Louis IX.
Yeah, Louis IX, right? And he is famous, and beloved in France. In fact, it's kind of, I have this wonderful magazine. In France, they tend to publish a lot of kind of popular history magazines. And there's one about Saint Louis, and it's just very interesting to see, despite the revolution, despite the considerable anti-clericalism and cynicism about the role of the Catholic Church, Saint Louis is still very kind of revered as this kind of almost ancestral kind of figure, as a French king and as a saint, right? So what we start to see with the French Revolution is the tearing apart of this association between the throne and the altar. And as people's contempt and anger about their mistreatment under social and political hierarchies starts to become expressed, so too does their being fed up with the Catholic clergy. In a sense, the Catholic Church had made it easy for them, because just like aristocrats wanted peasants and the urban poor to kind of pay their own kind of inflated, fat kind of salaries and depended on them basically for their wealth, the church did too. The church tithed ordinary people in ways that made them also kind of resentful.